Ghost Recon Breakpoint was the biggest disaster in Ubisoft's history. It was a broken, soulless looter shooter that almost killed the franchise. But in 2026, something impossible happened. The hardcore tactical community started calling it a masterpiece. Not a good for Ubisoft game, but actually a great title. So I spent the last 3 days trying to find out how a game this hated turned into the best tactical sandbox on the market. And the answer isn't just a few patches. It's a complete fundamental shift in what Ghost Recon even is. The biggest change Ubisoft made was adding Immersive Mode. This was a complete redesign of how the game works. At launch, Breakpoint was built around gear scores, which meant every gun had a number attached to it and you had to grind for better loot to deal more damage. It was The Division, but worse. The community hated it because it made no sense for a tactical shooter. Why would an M4 suddenly deal less damage just because it had a lower number? So the Immersive Mode removes all of that. Guns now perform based on their actual type, not some arbitrary level. An AK-47 feels like an AK-47. A sniper rifle is deadly because it's a sniper rifle, not because you found a higher tier version of it. This single change transformed the game from a looter shooter into an actual Ghost Recon experience. At this point, most people will tell you that if you're still playing with gear scores on, you're not really playing the game the way it's meant to be played. But here's the thing, Breakpoint still has problems. The world of Aroa is beautiful, but it feels empty. Wildlands had this vibrant, lived-in world with civilians, villages, and a sense of place. Breakpoint's world is sterile by comparison. There are no civilians, the environments are gorgeous, but they don't feel alive, and while some players argue that the loneliness fits the hunted survival vibe of the story, it's hard to deny that Wildlands had a better atmosphere. That said, mechanically, Breakpoint has more to offer. You can go prone and use camouflage to actually blend into terrain based on the surface you're lying on, which is something Wildlands didn't have. The injury system and the stamina mechanics add depth that Wildlands didn't have, and the animations in Breakpoint are also more realistic. But on the other hand, Wildlands is smoother to control. So it's a trade-off. Wildlands had the better world and better feel, while Breakpoint has more mechanics, but that doesn't always mean better. And here's where I need to be honest about something the Breakpoint community doesn't always want to admit. Wildlands feels more believable as a world. There are actual civilians, traffic, and radio stations when you're driving.
But man, when I smoke a lot of weed and I get the munchies, I need me some tacos!
Breakpoint uses martial law and lockdowns as an excuse for the empty streets, but that doesn't make it feel less sterile. The AI teammates in Wildlands also talk constantly. They comment on almost everything.
You guys seeing this?
Looks like a hell of a resort. A cartel-owned resort.
Let's go scare off some rich folk, fuck with the cartel's tourism, and get Carzita's ass back to Agua Verde.
In Breakpoint, however, even with AI teammates enabled, they barely interact beyond nice shots or you're just showing off. I get it. Breakpoint is going for the lone wolf vibe, but once you add teammates, that excuse falls apart. And weirdly, Wildlands feels more responsive to control. You know, as I've mentioned, Breakpoint has more animations, more tactical stance options, but Wildlands is more smoother and more arcade-like in a good way. Also, while the vehicle handling is terrible in both games, somehow Wildlands vehicles still feel better to drive. And on top of that, the world design in Wildlands was built for ground vehicles. Breakpoint's map is so vertical and filled with cliffs that you're constantly forced into helicopters, which makes all the other vehicles feel almost pointless. The level design in Breakpoint is technically superior, with better sightlines, multi-level buildings, underground tunnels and all, but the world between those bases is boring. Wildlands felt like a country. Breakpoint feels like a hiking simulator with high-tech bases dropped into it. Earlier I mentioned Immersive Mode, but it's about a lot more than just stripping away gear scores. It also allowed the survival mechanics to finally breathe and completely change how you approach combat. You can increase the risk of injuries, change how much stamina basic actions consume, disable health regen, and completely change how syringes function. And if you crank everything up to the max, the game shifts from a standard shooter into something closer to a stealth horror experience, a survival game rather than a power fantasy, if you will. There's also ammo loss on reloads, limited bandages which speaks for themselves, and a darker nights option which will make nights way more realistic and tactical. Now imagine turning up the enemy AI's difficulty all the way up and you're looking at a completely unique experience. As a result, enabling those hardcore settings creates a kind of tension that forces you to play the game tactically. And that tension is what makes Breakpoint feel like a real Ghost Recon game now. Another huge improvement is the AI teammates. At launch, Breakpoint forced you to play solo or with other players, meaning that for some reason they decided not to add the AI teammates to the game, a feature Wildlands had since day one. You could still use drones to perform synced headshots, but if you didn't like that, you were stuck with a frustrating experience. Fortunately, Ubisoft added AI teammates, and it completely changed how the game plays for solo players. It's not perfect, but it makes the game way more enjoyable if you don't want to rely on drones. Speaking of drones, that was one of the biggest complaints at launch. The game felt like it wanted you to sit back, mark every enemy with your drone, and then methodically clear camps without ever being in real danger. It would completely become boring, but with the AI teammates and the improved stealth mechanics, you can now play the game without relying on drones at all. You can turn off the enemy markers, disable the heads-up display elements, and force yourself to actually spot enemies manually. And once you do that, the game becomes infinitely more immersive. Another thing Breakpoint gets right is customization. The amount of tactical gear you can tweak is insane. You can adjust every piece of your loadout, mix and match camo patterns, and fine-tune your appearance down to the smallest detail. It's the kind of depth that makes you spend an hour in the menu just perfecting your look, and no other shooter comes close to offering this level of customization. Some call it tactical BARBIE, and to be honest, I think it perfectly describes this aspect of the game. Visually, the game still holds up pretty well, but to be fair, it's not that old either. What really matters is how the visual feed into immersion. The lighting is incredible, especially when you turn on the darkest night setting, which makes night vision goggles more useful. The weather effects are some of the best in the industry, especially with how the vegetation reacts to wind and movement, and the way mud and snow accumulate on your character as you move through the environment genuinely adds to the tactical feel. You know, it's not just about looking good, it's also about immersion, and Ubisoft did a hell of a good job with the game's visuals. Although, let me be perfectly clear about something. The cutscenes, they also suffer from the robotic issues seen in most of the recent Ubisoft releases. There are some good ones, and then there are some incredibly terrible ones. But at least everything else looks solid during the gameplay. But let's talk about exploration and progression, because this is where Breakpoint gets messy. First, the exploration. Turning off guided mode is great, because it forces you to actually scout and read the terrain. You get clues like north of the lake and east of the airfield instead of a waypoint, and it makes you feel like an actual scout. But the problem is, the world itself is boring to explore. The map is filled with question marks for points of interest, but about 90% of them are just a single crate with scale tech credits or a generic camo pattern. And the architectural repetition doesn't help either. In Wildlands, every region had a distinct visual identity. In Breakpoint, every base looks like the same grey futuristic Skeltech box. Look, I understand. There's a story reason for it, but it makes exploration feel unrewarding. Also, as I've mentioned earlier, the terrain design is constantly working against you. Breakpoint's map is filled with sheer cliffs and jagged mountains. The terrain forces you into specific lanes or makes you grab a helicopter. You spend more time looking at the map trying to find a slope you won't slide down than actually looking at the scenery. As a result, travel becomes a pathfinding puzzle instead of an adventure. Now, when it comes to progression, if you turn off gear levels, the progression becomes about finding blueprints and attachments. You see, for example, you hunt for an M4, find a good optic, and then the progression basically stops. You become maxed out in the first few hours, which makes the remaining game feel unrewarding to some. But here's the thing. Operation Motherland, which I will explain it in a bit, fixes this completely. Other than the conquest mode that makes the map feel more purposeful, it features the optical camo as a new progression tool. You level up your cloak by looting chests, which gives you a reason to revisit areas, and in turn, upgrading the cloak directly affects your stealth gameplay. It's more engaging, more rewarding, and it's a real progression system the base game should have had. But honestly, none of this would matter if Ubisoft hadn't quietly added what the community now considers the real game. Operation Motherland was a free expansion that introduced a new conquest mode, and it completely changes how Breakpoint is structured. The original campaign about finding Walker and the Rogue Ghost team is fine, But it's not great. It's predictable, it drags in places, and it doesn't take full advantage of the game's systems. Motherland, on the other hand, is structured like a proper tactical campaign. You're clearing territories, eliminating threats, filling regions with resistance units, and defeating regional bosses. Also, the focus shifts away from drones and sci-fi tech as the primary threat. Instead, you're fighting the Bodark, actual soldiers from Ghost Recon Future Soldier who use optical camo and feel like a real tactical challenge rather than just another wave of robots. It's how the base game should have been designed from the start, and most people now recommend skipping the main story entirely and jumping straight into Motherland. Frankly, I'd recommend that too. The main campaign has nothing interesting to offer unless you like to watch John Bernthal telling you something.
Let me tell you something. Your daddy, he ain't here.
The community has also figured out how to push the game even further thanks to the modding scene on PC. The Spartan Mod is considered mandatory by the hardcore community because it fixes a lot of the AI's artificial stupidity. It increases enemy detection ranges to realistic distances, makes suppressors actually sound like suppressors instead of being completely silent, and raises bullet damage across the board so that combat feels lethal for both you and the enemy. It's not for everyone, but if you want the most realistic experience possible and you're on PC, it's there. In my opinion, it's what separates the people who think Breakpoint is decent from the people who think it's a masterpiece. So, is Ghost Recon Breakpoint worth playing in 2026? If you hated it at launch and never looked back, it's a completely different game now. The looter-shooter elements are gone if you want them to be. The survival mechanics are deep if you choose to engage with them. The AI teammates make solo play more enjoyable, and Operation Motherland gives you the tactical campaign the game should have had from the start. But it's not perfect. The world still feels empty compared to Wildlands, the story is forgettable, and the fact that it took years of updates to get the game into this state is frustrating. Ubisoft shouldn't get a pass for launching a broken game and fixing it later. That's not something to celebrate. It's a bare minimum. Still, if you're looking for a tactical sandbox that sits somewhere between Call of Duty and Arma series, Breakpoint is the best option right now. It's not trying to be a hardcore meal sim, but it's also not a mindless shooter. It's comfortable, customizable, and once you turn off the UI and play it the way the community recommends, it's genuinely great. And with the next Ghost Recon on the horizon, Breakpoint has become the baseline of what we expect from the franchise moving forward. Whatever comes next has to match or exceed what Breakpoint finally managed to achieve. I'm curious what you think. Have you given Breakpoint another shot after all the updates? And do you think post-launch fixes like this are worth it, or should games just be complete from day one? Let me know in the comments.
Have you got her here?